Reminiscence about a certain visit. Source: Uusi Nainen, The New Woman, magazine of the Finnish Democratic League, 1952, April, issue 4. Lyli Takki has kindly allowed us to publish a reminiscence which she presented on the radio concerning the death of Madame Kollontai. Recently in Moscow, the life flame of Madame Alexandra Kollontai, the great daughter of the Soviet Union, was extinguished. Publishing the sorrowful news, the newspapers have recalled to our minds the life of the deceased, so stormy, so full of work, so triumphant. The honorable title of Ambassador of the Revolution corresponded fully to her, if to anyone, though our days are still probably too recent to be able, even approximately, to evaluate her life work. Even in our country, for a whole generation, it was hardly necessary to explain who she was. She was Madame Kollontai, and that was enough. She was a great revolutionary fighter already since youth, beautiful, wise, noble. She had an excellent education, tremendous work ethic, hurried from country to country like a ball of fire, persecuted, even familiar with prisons, ever more well known, famous. Then she became her country's diplomatic representative and an ambassador, the first woman ambassador in the world. Additionally to us, she became somewhat like a relative, and always sympathetic, even in our evil days. We shall hear factual presentations of the life and work of Alexandra Kollontai in many connections, and therefore, with the sorrowful news, perhaps I'll be permitted to present also a small reminiscence about a visit to her home on the bank of the Great Kaluga 3 years ago. With the friendly help of our Soviet ambassador, the visit took place on a December afternoon after becoming acquainted decades ago. Today we are having an international day indeed, Mrs. Kollontai says, almost as her first words, greeting me cheerfully from her chair. We were told that just before us, the lovely home had been visited by first a Polish and then a Mexican young woman. In actuality, many days of the year were probably equally international there, bearing in mind how well known the inhabitant of the house was and how many personal friends she had all over the world. Our audience began at around 5 in the evening, sitting around a cozy coffee table. We were all old acquaintances in one way or another, having already met in Finland during the last year of the First World War. And it soon became clear that to our host, after all this time, Finland was still not an unfamiliar or an unimportant country. She had personally known its scarce lights and deep shadows of the previous century already since childhood. Later, during the fiercest fire of her life, her path again led to Finland, or through Finland to the broad outside world. In 1903, she published a very accomplished scientific work, Life of the Finnish Workers, where she presented her findings with numerous statistics. Also, while working as a diplomat for her country for 15 years in Sweden, and prior to that for 2 years in Norway, she was close to our country and followed its events and developments with sympathetic interest. As we remembered, Mrs. Kollontai participated in arranging the peace negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. When in the course of the discussion, the Tretyakov Art Gallery and its high-quality artworks were mentioned, Madame pointed out, quote, "But in Finland you also have good artists. I have seen their works, especially in the Atheneum National Gallery of Helsinki," unquote. She particularly remembered Galeen Kallila as a great Finnish painter and mentioned also Sibelius, the noblest master of our musical art. Further, she remembered, for example, the academic bookstore as a notable representative in its field already decades ago. Another beautiful recognition for Finnish culture. When the discussion momentarily ventured into the economic development of our country, Mrs. Kollontai expressed her opinion that the cooperative movement has played a large part in raising the living standard of the Finnish people. Quote, "I wrote about your cooperative movement in the press of my country already when the headquarters of Elanto, Finnish chain of cooperative shops, was still only a small wooden house, because I understood how significant it is, especially for poor people, to combine their economic strength," unquote. An hour, even a little more, went by almost unnoticed in the lively conversation around the hospitable table. There were 4 of us, including Madame's loyal friend and housekeeper, each giving their active contribution to the discussion. There was in the room also a 5th persona grata, Cat Alexander in his spotless frock coat, including even a white collar and vest, all provided by nature itself. Alexander was 4 years of age. A few years earlier, Mrs. Kollontai had been met with an illness which largely forced her to remain in place. Ceaseless and extremely exhausting mental exertion lasting decades eventually wears down anybody's strength. But mentally she was still as alert and cheerful as in her days of good health, kept informed about events, and still worked hard writing. Her whole being still radiated that same victorious glow, the same intellect as decades ago in the crossfire of the hardest struggles when she gave and received blows, fighting for the downtrodden and oppressed. And we particularly owe a debt of gratitude to Alexandra Kollontai for her devoted and powerful work on our behalf. During our country's great resistance struggle against Tsarist Russification policies, she made the justice of our cause known to the Central European, British and American public in her speeches and writings. Likewise, in 3 large works, she explained about our country and people to the international community. All of that meant a lot to us, because even then, Mrs. Kollontai was an internationally known and respected cultural and revolutionary fighter. Her activity had striking power and reach against the conservative government and gained results. Now she has left the world of the living, a world for the more just and bright future of which she uncompromisingly gave her all. It was a lot, the intense work of a long life. People like that leave behind something like a glittering ray of light. So did she, the ambassador of humanity, Alexandra Kollontai.